Hi, this is John Mearsheimer, and I'm back again with another episode. And this time I want to talk about the Iran war. And what I'd like to argue here is that it's time for President Trump to settle this war, to reach an agreement with the Iranians to put an end to it, and in effect to accept defeat, to recognize that Iran has won this war and that we have lost the war. And the way I'd like to proceed is I'd first like to talk about the goals that the United States set out to achieve at the start of this war. And then I'd like to talk about our failure to achieve any of those goals. And I'd like to describe how badly off we are in terms of having pursued these particular goals. And then I want to switch and talk about the military strategies that we have employed in pursuit of those goals. And of course, the argument that I'm going to make is that the different strategies that we have employed have failed to achieve the goals that we set out with in this war. And I want to talk at some length about those different strategies and why they failed. And I'm going to make the argument, as will become clear, that there were 5 potential strategies that the United States could pursue. It only pursued 3 of them. 2 it did not pursue. And I'll talk about those 3 strategies and why they failed. And then I'll talk about the 2 strategies we didn't pursue and why we did not pursue them. And you want to keep in mind here that what I'm going to be constantly doing is talking about the relationship between the goals that we're pursuing and the strategies that we adopted or didn't adopt to achieve those goals. But let's start with the goals. When the war started, the United States, and this was true of the Israelis as well, had 4 goals. The first goal was regime change in Tehran. The second goal was to make sure to eliminate Iran's ability to enrich uranium. Because if you can enrich uranium, you can rather easily make a nuclear weapon. The third goal was to eliminate Ukraine's long-range ballistic missile program. And the fourth goal was to basically get Iran to no longer support Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Those were the 4 goals. And very importantly, I think regime change was the most important of those 4 goals, because if you didn't achieve regime change, you really could not achieve the other 3 goals. So regime change was the numero uno goal, but you still had these 3 other very important goals that were, in my opinion, subordinated to that overarching goal. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, where are we today in terms of those goals? And let me make 2 different sets of arguments here. First of all, just looking at the 4 goals. We have achieved none of the 4 goals. None of them have been achieved, and there's no evidence any of them are going to be achieved anytime soon. In addition to that, we are now in a situation which we were not in back on February 27th, the day before the war started, where Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, and today, as we speak, has shut off the flow of traffic in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. Furthermore, on February 27th, the day before the war, the United States had a robust alliance structure with the Gulf states in the region, and it had a serious set of military bases in the region. Today, those bases have been either badly damaged or destroyed, and the alliance structure that the United States had with the Gulf states has been basically torn to tatters. To take this a step further, the international economy, because of the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, is in a very dangerous situation, and there is a real risk of a worldwide depression if this war is not settled sometime soon. And then finally, I would note that China, which is America's principal adversary, according to the Trump administration, has benefited enormously from this conflict. So this is a situation where the United States has not only not achieved any of the four goals it set out with, it also has a number of other serious problems today that did not exist on February 27th, the day before the war started. Let me come at this from a different perspective. If you look at the memorandum of understanding that President Trump signed with the Iranians on June 17th of this year, this memorandum of understanding was designed to shut the war down. What you see is that that was basically a surrender document. President Trump basically conceded every point that was at issue between the Iranians and the Americans. The way the document was set up, this is the Memorandum of Understanding, is that we would have a ceasefire up front. The fighting would stop, and the Strait of Hormuz would be opened up. And furthermore, the Iranians would be able to sell oil on the open markets, which had not been the case before the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding was signed. They could sell oil without having to worry about American sanctions. That was the first part of the agreement. Again, to get a ceasefire, number one, and number two, to open up the strait. Then there would be a 60-day negotiating period, and at the end of that 60-day negotiating period, there would be a decision on the nuclear issue. But it was very clear that the Iranians would maintain a nuclear enrichment capability, which was at odds with one of the goals we had going into the war. Furthermore, it was clear that the United States would have to allow all of those frozen Iranian assets to go back to Iran. And furthermore, reparations would have to be paid to the Iranians for all of the damage that was done to Iran in this war. And an enormous amount of damage was done. So an enormous amount of money would have to be paid to the Iranians. On top of all of this, the Iranians would be able to sell oil freely on world oil markets. So all of this is to say that if you look at the Memorandum of Understanding, the United States conceded on every key issue. The Iranians prevailed. So, in terms of the goals that we went into this war with, we failed to achieve any of them, and we ended up much worse off after the war got going. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, what happened here? We had a set of different military strategies that we tried to use to achieve those four goals that we set out with. And the question you want to ask yourself is, what were those strategies and why did they fail? Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to frame the discussion in terms of what I think are the 5 possible strategies that the United States was presented with, and then describe what happened, and then analyze why the strategies didn't fail. So I'm going to lay out the 5 strategies, then I'm going to describe what happened from February 28th up to the present in terms of employing those strategies, and then I'm going to analyze why they failed. Here are the 5 strategies. The first 3 involve air power, the 4th involves naval power, and the 5th involves land power or armies. Regarding air power, the first strategy is what I would call discriminate air campaign. Okay, a discriminate air campaign. And when I say discriminate, a discriminate air campaign is basically a strategic bombing campaign where you do not go after certain targets. In other words, you discriminate. And in this case, a discriminate air campaign involves going after military targets, a handful of civilian targets, and civilian infrastructure, but basically staying away from massive attacks on civilian infrastructure and staying away from the oil facilities in Iran. Now, when I say civilian infrastructure, this means staying away from bridges, staying away from attacking bridges, staying away from attacking power stations, and of course, staying away from attacking the oil facilities, the oil and gas facilities inside of Iran. This is what a discriminate air campaign, a discriminate strategic bombing campaign looks like. I contrast that with an indiscriminate air campaign. An indiscriminate air campaign is where the United States and the Israelis go after all of the targets that I just described as being legitimate in a discriminate air campaign, but also going after civilian infrastructure, power stations, bridges, and going after oil facilities. In other words, targeting all of the possible targets inside of Iran. That's an indiscriminate air campaign as opposed to a discriminate air campaign. The third strategy is tit for tat. And this is an air campaign as well, but it involves small-scale attacks where one side hits the other and then the other hits back. And that's what I call tit for tat. It's on a much smaller scale than either the discriminate or indiscriminate strategic bombing campaigns, much more limited. So those are the three strategies that involve air power. Then the one strategy that involves naval power is a blockade, a maritime blockade. And in this case, the Iranians are blockaded by the US Navy. Then the final option involves the Army, and this is a ground invasion. This is a land attack against Iran. The United States could try and conquer an island or two that belonged to Iran in the Persian Gulf. The United States could try to invade the Iranian mainland. It could concentrate on all of the territory that Iran controls around the Strait of Hormuz for the purpose of trying to open the Strait of Hormuz with land power. So those are the 5 strategies that the United States had on its menu. Now, let me switch gears and describe which strategies the United States used at which points in time. And then I want to analyze them. And of course, when I analyze them, what I'm going to try to do is explain why those strategies failed to achieve the goals that the United States was pursuing when it started the war on February 28th. But to go to the description, on February 28th, when the United States launches the air war, which lasts until April 8th, it's basically a 40-day war, the United States pursues a discriminate air campaign. They start off, as almost everybody acknowledges, with a shock and awe campaign that's designed to decapitate the regime. And in fact, the United States and the Israelis are successful at decapitating the regime, and they clearly launch a shock and awe strategy. But it's all part of a discriminate air campaign. It's very important to understand that with a few exceptions, the United States and the Israelis do not hit power plants, civilian bridges, or oil facilities and gas facilities in Iran. In other words, it's not an indiscriminate air campaign. It's a discriminate air campaign, and it lasts 40 days. At the end of those 40 days, a ceasefire is put in place. But it's very important to understand that right before the ceasefire on April 8th, President Trump was talking about putting Iran back in the Stone Age. On April 7th, he said, this is on April 7th, a whole civilization will die tonight. What's going on here is that President Trump, over the course of the 40-day war, is beginning to think about moving from a discriminate air campaign to an indiscriminate air campaign. That's on April 7th. He makes that comment about a whole civilization dying. Okay? That's on April 7th. Then on April 8th, he switches gears, and we've seen him do this many times now. He switches gears and he says it's time for a ceasefire. Ceasefire comes on April 8th. Then there are actually negotiations. You remember when J.D. Vance went to Islamabad to talk with the Iranians. This was on April 11th and April 12th about putting an end to the war. Remember, we have a ceasefire starting on April 8th. The 40-day bombing campaign has ended. And April 11th, April 12th, Vice President Vance is talking with the Iranians about ending the war. It doesn't work. The negotiations fail. The ceasefire basically remains in place. Very important to understand that. But what we do on April 13th, the following day, April 13th, is we decide to employ a naval blockade. Between April 13th and June 17th, the United States has a naval blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, which is effectively a naval blockade on Iran. Then on June 17th, the United States signs the memorandum of understanding that I described earlier. As I told you, that was basically a surrender document. This is telling you, in effect, and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, that the blockade did not work. So we sign on June 17th the memorandum of understanding with the Iranians, and it looks like we're moving to put an end to the war. What then happens in early July is that the United States decides that it's going to violate the memorandum of understanding. It's very important to understand that Article 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding says that Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz during the 60-day negotiating period. And you understand that once the Memorandum of Understanding is signed on June 17th, we then move into this 60-day period where the two sides are going to negotiate and deal with all those issues that are still on the table. And during this 60-day period, the Memorandum of Understanding makes clear that Iran controls the Gulf. But the United States decides in early July that it's going to basically violate the agreement. And the United States is going to create, with the Omanis, a channel through the Strait of Hormuz that Iran doesn't control, that in effect the United States controls. The Iranians say this is unacceptable. The Iranians start shooting at ships that go through that channel. And of course the United States retaliates, and then Iran retaliates, and then the United States retaliates. This is the tit for tat campaign. So you see what's happened here. We had a 40-day air campaign, right? 40-day air campaign, which was a discriminate air campaign. That ended, and then we went to the blockade, and now we're involved in tit for tat. It starts on July 7th. That's when the tit for tat campaign starts. And I would argue it goes up to about July 31st. So the ceasefire is now over. Remember, the ceasefire was on April 8th, and you basically had a ceasefire involving Iran and the United States, Iran and Israel, and the Gulf states and Iran. You basically had a ceasefire from April 8th up until July 7th when the tit for tat starts.